Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on a couple worm bins that need feeding, or at least I'm assuming that they need feeding. So it's been 12 days since we checked in on them. It's the twin bins, the twin original red wiggler bins that you see here in front of us, stacked one on top of the other. It was 12 days ago that we last fed them. And that was feeding number 11, so today's feeding is going to be number 12, so it seems like 12 is the theme of the day. And the age of those bins is 128, so there's even a 12 in there. But whatever, it's time to get the glove on, time to get these systems up on the bench, and it's time to get them fed. So let's get to work. So I don't think there's any real significance to the number 12 or the 12-day interval that has elapsed since the last feeding and now. But oddly enough, when I reviewed the video from the last check-in, I did actually make reference to maybe coming back in here in another 12 days. Perhaps there had just been a 12-day interval between the feedings then too. I don't recall if that was the case, but that might have been the only reason that I alluded to the potential of us maybe coming back in here 12 days later. But one way or another, we seem to have managed to predict when we'd be back in here. One thing we did last week, out of curiosity to try this material out that I've got this material where I took a whole bunch of corn cobs. Actually, it started at my mom's house. She had a whole bunch of corn that had been, I don't even remember why, it just ended up becoming worm food, but there was a good bit of it. I don't know if it just didn't taste right or something about it. So she had all this corn, and it was corn on the cob, so it had not been eaten yet. It was just uneaten corn that she took the time to throw in her oven and to dry it out to a certain point. And then I even brought it home and I further dried it by cutting it into smaller pieces and resting it outside on a nice warm sunny day to bake in the sun. And then at the end, I put it into my little grinder, personal blender, and made a fine, flaky material out of it. And I've been putting it into one or two of my systems. This was one of the systems where we had put it in, and we had placed it in diagonally, right across the top of everything, right over the feeding zone indicators, across the top covering newspaper. And I think that that's kind of what I'm seeing remnants of here and there, little bits of the flaked corn cob. I would think the actual corn kernels that had gotten flaked up were probably all eaten, but perhaps some of the tougher corn cob material that they received as well in that mixed up, ground up corn mush, or whatever you want to call it, flaky material. Perhaps that stuff is what we're seeing some leftovers of. I didn't really think there'd be any leftovers, but I'm still kind of just experimenting with that stuff. I've added it to a few of my systems, and I've still got some of it left up in the freezer. And now I'm also in the process of taking some old corn cobs, even in the case of my collection that I've got going on. Even some of those are actual corn cobs that still have the corn kernels on them. The other day when the oven had to be turned on anyway, I put them in there to dry, and they're actually nice and toasty now because of having been placed in the oven. And I figured, you know, instead of always putting corn cobs like this into the bins and waiting forever for the stuff to break down, perhaps by grinding it up it might get to the finish line a lot quicker. And I'm certain that that's going to be the case, because these corn cobs have been in here who knows how long, probably a couple months, and they're still only at this stage of breakdown. But I figured by grinding it up into a flaky consistency, then the stuff, there's nowhere for the stuff to hide, you know. Every little bit of it almost is readily available to the breakdown process to be consumed by the worms and their helper critters in the systems. So I figured maybe this season I would try to deviate from just putting aside the corn cobs and placing them into the systems whole, and maybe trying this whole idea of grinding up the corn cobs into flaky material so that it'll break down quicker and not just be a slow composting item, but perhaps a fast to medium speed composting material. So we've excavated bin number 1's feeding area and found a few old corn cobs. So I'm assuming that since these are twin bins, we're going to be bumping into even more. It's kind of nice to see that these corn cobs are now permitting themselves to be broken up into smaller pieces. In the past, we had already broken some of them up into smaller bits, but not all of them would give yet. But as time goes on, they're gradually getting to the point where it seems like we can break them up a little bit more easily now. Certainly not to the degree that the little personal blender is able to do in a jiffy and just turn it into a nice flaky consistency. I have this stuff in my freezer because it's not completely dry, and since it has a little bit of moisture content, I thought that maybe I would try to avoid allowing the stuff to get moldy or whatever because it has moisture content. So that's the reason I'm storing it in the freezer. I've still got a little bit of it left to go to consume the last of it before I whip up the next batch. So in time I'll have more, but I do need to eventually get rid of the existing stash of this stuff. So I've got replacement feeding zone indicators, so these old torn up coffee filters can go down into the feeding area. In fact, this top covering newspaper that had been draped out across the top is just barely even recognizable as a sheet of paper anymore, so those can go in there too. And after we apply the frozen kitchen scraps and a couple days worth of coffee, we'll have replacement feeding zone indicators to position over our feeding areas. So, you know, as long as we're in the process already now of rebuilding their feeding zones, let's just go ahead and return all these bits of corn cob that every time I get my hands on one, I just want to try to break it up now. But let's get them all back down into the feeding area, and then we can come in here with the stuff that I bought down for them. And it's an assortment of different types of fruits and veggies and a day's worth of corn, as I mentioned earlier. And in addition to that, there's also a couple pieces of napkin and paper towel, which I thought we can also supplement the bedding in the system with. And I think this is similar to what we did last time. We might have come down here with bits of soiled paper towel that needed to be composted. So we're sort of giving them a similar treatment to last time, with the exception of the pulverized corn cob concoction that I've got. But it does seem like it was pretty well received, and it does seem like, despite the fact that there are some leftovers remaining of it in here still, I suspect that this stuff will probably be gone pretty soon. At least I'm not expecting it to be around for much longer, at least not in a recognizable form. And whether or not what we saw was even that, I'm not even certain, 100% certain, but it probably is, just based on the fact that it had been placed out on the top surface. I can't imagine what else that might have been. So let's get in here with some of these delicious foods. We've got cantaloupe melon rinds here. These are compliments of my mom. I bought these home from her house the other day. These peels of cucumber are compliments of my garden, because my garden has a number of cucumber vines growing, and they're very, very productive, constantly providing a supply of nice big cucumbers. And then here we've got the stem end of a head of romaine lettuce, and I think there's only one of those. So since bin number 1 is getting that, we'll throw these things into bin number 2 to try to keep things fair and balanced. So the last stuff that we've got as far as frozen kitchen scraps to apply down here are these corn cobs. And you know, it's not a terribly huge feeding, but I think it'll be good to tie them over for the next few days. I'm not going to try to predict how long it'll be between now and the next check-in, I think it was just a fluke that I anticipated that we'd be back in here in 12 days, and now we are back here in 12 days. Sometimes it's weird because I sort of get into a feeding pattern where I have 7 days or 10 days between feedings, but then as I sort of go through all my bins, it's all getting back into the same sequence, and they're all being fed at the same interval. And not so long ago, I felt like I was getting back to the beginning of the sequence after only a week, and I was leaving only a week's time interval between feedings, but now we've extended the time period a little bit longer, which is a little bit more realistic, I think. You know, I got some other stuff we're going to put in here. I'll be back in one moment. Alright, so one of the things that we're going to put in is my worm chow that I like to sprinkle down onto the coffee. And the other thing I like to include with some of my feedings in my worm bins is the grit. And the grit is just something that goes into the worm's gut along with the foods that they're consuming. And their gut is actually a gizzard, is the organ, the digestive organ, in which they break down the foods that they're eating, but they don't have stomach acids. They break down their foods in a more of a sort of a mechanical grinding process. So these rough, these tough materials that they get, the grit, in this case pulverized eggshell, is the sort of stuff that they use in their grit to break down the foods that they're eating. I mean, some people use pulverized crustacean shell or sand even, or any one of a number of different types of materials could be used in the worm bins to serve as grit. And I've seen enough examples out there of people doing tests in their own worm bins to show that the grit is not absolutely critical and that the worms can easily break down the materials that they need to eat without the grit. But it is probably something that's going to help speed things along in the breakdown process if they have that little bit of helper material in their gizzards to break down the stuff that they're consuming. And I guess in addition to that, there's also just the consideration of me needing to get rid of eggshells on a pretty regular basis. And that too is another one of those things that my mom contributes to the cause. Eggshells from there and eggshells from here do add up over time. So everyone's happy when the eggshells are being disposed of in a conscientious, responsible fashion. Alright, so we've tilled up the feeding area, we've replenished the supply of food and bedding in there. We've inspected the outer edge nearest me, but before we wrap things up here, I'm just going to continue with that and make sure things on this edge closer to you is in good shape, and then we'll be finished here. Yeah, for systems being 128 days of age at this point, it does seem like they're doing really good in here. These worms are really plowing through the materials that we give them, and they've produced a huge number of castings. And I've been running some of my systems well up into the 300 plus day range, a lot of them even exceeding a year before finally coming to an end. But I think as a general consideration for all my systems, I've been thinking that maybe we don't need to run our systems for quite so long. So somehow I predict somehow not seeing these systems being active for quite that long. I could certainly see us wanting to get to the point where we can harvest these castings long before we would reach 300 days of the bins being in service. But I don't know, we'll have to see how that all plays out. But I do have a feeling that that's probably going to be my new approach, or updated approach, to the lifespans of my systems. I'm always trying different things, and I guess I was sort of on a trend of letting my systems run for quite a while, but I might have already mentioned it once or twice in the past that I think it might be better off to try to bring them to an end sooner and then get the worms working on fresh stuff sooner rather than leaving them in their, in their castings for such an extended period of time. So I've got a couple things I've got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away here, but before I do that and take up your time with something so boring, I'm just going to leave the video at that. But before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.